Hey, it's Deuteronomy. Welcome back. We are in the fifth book of the Old Testament. We made it farther than most do, I think, in this journey, flying through books like Leviticus and Numbers. And we saw a lot of cool stuff, didn't we? And a lot to continue to think about as we circle back around. Certainly, I'm not doing justice to the depth of most of these things, but remember our goal here is kind of big picture, trying to kind of get a lay of the land here that'll become more than just a casual reference soon as we'll see here talked about in the book of Deuteronomy and then happening in the book of Joshua as God's people enter the land that he promised to Abraham and his descendants, which is them. And of course, God is as concerned with how the people live in the land than he is about them being in the land. The land is the promise, and they're getting there here in the story, but how they live is of the utmost importance. So as we turn to Deuteronomy, again, it's sort of like a pause, if you will, at the end of Numbers. We were kind of, it felt like we were ready to kind of go after it. But then Deuteronomy puts a pause on that, and it's kind of like, all right, folks, before we do this, let's check these boxes. Let's make sure we know what we're doing here. Let's remember what happened. Let's remember the mistakes that we and our parents made. Excuse me. Before we go here, let's remember where we've been, where God has brought us, where we're going, and how we're to live. And so this is Deuteronomy is kind of this long pause before the entry in the promised land, and I kind of like that. So the narration of Deuteronomy is a little bit different, where in most of these books so far, there's just kind of a narrator telling us what happened. Here, there's a narrator of sorts behind the text as we begin, and he's kind of introducing Moses, and then it's kind of handed off where this is a lot of this is kind of an extended speech of Moses, like a long sermon, maybe, if you will. So we pick up in chapter 1 in our reading today's chapters 1 through 3. Fairly reasonable amount of text today, and I'm excited about what's going to be in Deuteronomy. There's going to be a lot here for us. So it starts in chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan, opposite. Okay, a lot of names. In any case, there are on the other side of the Jordan still. And these are the words were introduced here that Moses spoke. So traditionally, all 5 of these books of the Torah, the Pentateuch, are called the books of Moses. And I don't know. We can talk more about what that does and doesn't mean, but certainly Moses is very actively involved here. Certain things probably only Moses could have told. So this is definitely Moses is definitely in the game here. And again, most of this book, particularly, is in the mouth of Moses. Yet the end, we'll talk about Moses' death. So obviously, Moses didn't write that part. So we have just some interesting things to think about as far as how the Bible kind of comes about and comes together in different people that God uses to kind of bring that together, and some that we know about, names and people like Moses, others that kind of put some finishing touches on this that maybe other biblical characters we know, but it's not said in this text itself. So this is interesting. So in verse 2, it takes 11 days to go from Horeb. Mount Horeb is another term for Mount Sinai, where Moses first sees the burning bush, where ultimately they receive the 10 Commandments, and they're camped out there for quite a while in Exodus before things move on through the journey. So, but this is interesting. It takes 11 days basically to go from Mount Sinai to the edge of where they can enter the promised land. And yet it took them how long to get there? 40 years. 11 days, 40 years. Could have done it in 11 days, but because of their disobedience, and that'll be recounted very specifically here in the text as well. So verse 3, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, so we're almost there, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. Verse 5, east of the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law. He began to teach, to explain, right? He wanted to make sure. And remember now, this is all the next generation. These are not, remember that those who rebelled against the command to enter the land, they were too afraid. They believed the 10 who said we can't do it. God said, you're not going to enter the land. But they're little kids. Some of them would have come out of Egypt, but mostly it's the next generation. And so Moses is really making sure that they understand. They understand this. And there's a lot of lessons for us about the need to kind of reteach God's ways, to every generation there as well. So in the section of, again, there's a lot in here. What am I going to talk about? What am I going to not talk about as much? It's hard to, it's hard to say and what to focus on and what not in a limited amount of time, right? Each one of these sections could be a sermon, could be a 20 or 30 minute talk, discussion in and of itself. But Moses, and we'll see this again, recounts this thing that's kind of part of his life story of being overwhelmed by the burden that he has of this role of leading these people. You are thinking of the people. You are too heavy of a burden for me to carry alone. You guys are a lot to handle, a lot to deal with. Verse 10. The Lord your God increased your numbers so that today you are as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now, where does that phrase come from? Do you recall? Because we need to remember that these stories are stacking on one another. They're moving a larger narrative forward, and so these phrases and ideas are not just random. They're pointing back to often the case. We see just how important God's covenant with Abraham is to everything that goes forward, very much including Jesus in the New Testament. Abraham is so important. You can't understand the biblical story if you don't have some foundational understanding of Abraham. So I'm not going to turn back there, but in Genesis, I think it's chapter 26. There's probably a couple different mentions of, but there's several things that God promises him about how numerous his descendants will be, like sand on the seashore, like stars in the sky. And so this statement made here is pointing towards God's fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. God's fulfilling his promises, which ought not to surprise us. But here's the thing with there's always this thing about God's promises and the fulfillment of them, which is solid, steady, right? But the time frame, this never ceases to be a challenge for us, for humans, for people. We see it, they're waiting for the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. And then we see it as well, too, with the return of Jesus, and places like the letters of Timothy and Peter talk about, God is not slow in coming, and these kind of things. So we need to keep in mind that, again, as we wrestle with this, we know that God's plans, God's big picture plans, will come to fruition. But within that, what does the timeline look like? We don't always know for sure, and sometimes there's detours and moving forward and those kind of things. But we're gonna get there, right? We didn't get from Sinai to the Promised Land in 11 days. Because of people's disobedience, that got a long pause. But our disobedience does not stop God's plan, right? God's covenant intention. His promises are not deterred, forever. He will fulfill what he sets out to do, even if it takes 40 years instead of 11 days. God will be proved to be faithful in that. So that's good news for us here today as well. So it's interesting in this discussion about other people to kind of help leaders, if you will. In chapter 1, still verse 13, choose some wise, understanding, and respected men from each of your tribes, and I will set them over you. So these people have responsibility for larger groups of people, and yet the people choose those who are kind of worthy of that respect. So it's interesting how this works. And it'll be interesting to track that as we go forward. I'm thinking about like in the book of Acts, where there's need for more people, more leadership, if you will. That the people choose some from among them. So he said, who do you respect? Who do you look to as being wise? And we'll set those people as having that responsibility. So it's kind of an interesting thing. We'll kind of think more about that, like when other times when God just raises people up and says, you're like with Moses, you're the one who's going to lead. But in other times, it's more the maturity and the wisdom. That's kind of how like the elder idea works, I think, throughout most of the Old Testament story. And then we can talk about how it relates to the New Testament or not. Is it's not, the elders aren't necessarily specifically like, handpicked by God, but they're people that are well respected. They're mature. They follow the Lord. They're wise. And so those are the people that are looked to provide wisdom and decision making and leadership and those kind of things. And then, as we saw, like in Numbers, in that story, that God put His Spirit on them, to enable them to be able to do that. Then, so really, just an interesting discussion, I think. And so, one of the things that they do, these folks, is they help to adjudicate conflicts between people. They need some intervention, some judges, right, if you will. And so Moses says, if it's really hard, I'll do it, but you hear the disputes between your people, the people that are part of your tribe, your clans, and that kind of thing. There's some basic instruction here, right? I'm in verse 16. Hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. Really interesting. Again, just so many mentions of this, need for justice and fairness, no matter who it is, not showing favoritism because they're part of, maybe your family and not somebody else. So really, the provisions for the foreigner residing among you are really interesting. And great and small. So if you're an important person or a wealthy person or not, like that shouldn't be factors in the thing. In verse 19 following, he recounts sending out the spies. So we saw this in Numbers, this story told, and it's told here with some different flavor. So one of the interesting things that we can do, I would encourage you to do, as we're reading Deuteronomy and some of the same things are mentioned, you can do a little compare and contrast, which things are reported the same, which different nuances are pointed out. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the 4 different gospel accounts that we have in the New Testament, right? There's differences that are brought out in the story, and sometimes they're just little nuances. Sometimes they're more challenging things to kind of to think about, and sometimes they're just different perspectives. And so we have that to kind of think about if you want to, as you go back through Deuteronomy. Hopefully you remember some of the details from Leviticus, Numbers, but perhaps if you want to, you can go back and compare, but that's probably more time than we're going to likely spend in our attempt to kind of read through here relatively efficiently. As always, whenever you're watching this, if you want to leave your insights from the day, your comments, your questions, the things that are just on your mind as a result of having done the reading, please feel free to do that. If you're joining me and you haven't a lot before, I'm kind of taking this as a reader as it comes, not as somebody who is doing research every day to kind of do formulated teaching on these things. I'm just kind of processing and thinking about the connections that I see and the questions that I have and the things that I'm wrestling through. But it's been neat because a lot of times either just choosing to think about it more myself, read more about it myself, or through some of your comments or challenges or that kind of thing too is helped me think more deeply about it. So I'm processing it as it comes. This is not my last word. This is kind of how I'm responding to it, processing it. And I personally, my take is I like to come to the text, be honest about it, about how it hits me, but it's not about me being the arbiter of it. Ultimately, I want to come away from Scripture having my mind shaped by God's, by God's sight, by God's saying, not by my feelings or opinions. But I come at it where I come at it. Where I leave it is hopefully in a more mature place. So that's just kind of how that goes. So Moses recounts the story. Of course, it is what it is as far as the exploration of the land. It's kind of interesting in those like differences. In that here in this story, the idea seems to be, so I'm in verse 22, chapter 1 still, that all of you came to me and said, let us send out men to be spies, where in Numbers, that's not really brought out. It seems like it's either more God and or Moses' idea. But here, Moses says it was their idea. So there's always, behind the stories that's told on the page, there's always more to the story. That's why, like I mentioned, like in the Gospels, sometimes they can point out, one will point out other details that don't. It's not necessarily because they're, that's a problem. It's because there's always, if we were there on the ground to see things, there's always more that's going on that is able to be recorded on the page. And so sometimes there'll be different things brought out in different places. Other times they'll be more challenging to figure out how that works together. Again, other times it just rounds out the story, which is really helpful, I think, in a sense, for us. So what do I want to point out? This is what I want to point out. Let me spend just a minute or two here in chapter 1, verse 29 and following, because I love this whole section because it's speaking to me. I believe not just like to me, like in a whatever way, but it's speaking of God's character, God's faithfulness, God's provision, which is, I believe, one of the primary things that Moses needs this generation who's going to enter the promised land to understand that God is faithful, that God, what he calls us to in response is in response to his provision and his faithfulness. So let me just make a couple comments about some of these verses. Again, chapter 1, verse 29, that section and following. Then I said to you, do not be terrified and do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God who is going before you. There's a theological idea called prevenient grace. That God's grace is always first, right? Comes ahead of any response that we might have. The Lord your God is going before you. Will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his sons all the way you went until you reached this place. So God has been there, has been providing, rescued in the past, will go before you now in the future. God is the same. His character is unchanging. Now, there's an interesting thing that's going on here that I think we'll see in other instances that's even more kind of profound, is that Moses is speaking even to the generation that was not there in Egypt, right? Because many of these people were born in the wilderness, right? Anybody under the age of 40 was born in the wilderness. So they were not literally in Egypt. And yet, there's such continuity and solidarity amongst these people that even those who didn't physically have their feet on the ground in Egypt, he speaks to them as if they were there. Okay, I think that's really an important thing to kind of notice, because it's different than the way that we would think. These people are people. I mean, yes, they're individuals. As we see very clearly, this individual culpability, responsibility, but there's also this collective thing. They are not just persons, but they are also a people. And so this continuity and connection is really important. I think, remember, sometimes they can be called Jacob. The people collectively can be called Jacob because they're the descendants of this man Jacob, who's called Israel, the people, right? So that's not a way we tend to think, but it's really important to understand the biblical narrative. And I love this phrase, carried you as a father carries his son. Other imagery that's used in scripture is, I carried you on eagle's wings, right? The idea again and again being God's care, God's provision, God's salvation, God doing it, not not them doing it themselves. God's rescue, God's provision, God's help. That's here all throughout the story. Verse 32, in spite of this, right? In opposition to this, to God's provision and care, you did not trust in the Lord your God. So that's the response. That's always the paradigm in the Bible. God's provision, our response of faith, trust. Like these words are integrated together, right? God provides, we respond and to God's provision and trust. God, you were faithful yesterday. I'm going to trust that you're going to be faithful for today, and I'm going to trust that you're going to be faithful in what you've called me to tomorrow. That was a real struggle for them, but again, this is not just a call for blind faith. This is a call to say, God has been faithful. Trust that he will continue to be faithful. They don't do that so often, that's a big problem, of course, right? In spite of this, you did not trust in the Lord your God. Verse 32, verse 33, who went ahead of you on the journey in fire by night, in the cloud by day. This is familiar from Exodus, right? Etc. To search out places for you to camp and to show you the way you should go. That's interesting. That seems to me new. Not to show you the way you should go, but to search out places for you to camp. Again, beyond what we can see, God is thinking about our future, right? God is looking out for what's ahead for us, even though we can't see it yet. God is already making a way. God is already providing for where we're going to be next, even though we can't see that. We only see the next step, the next thing ahead. But God is that many steps ahead, right? Making a way, making provision for us so that when we get there, it'll be good. It'll be good for us. When the Lord, verse 34, when the Lord heard what you said, he was angry, because when they didn't trust him, right? They angry and solemnly swore, no one from this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to your ancestors, except for Caleb. He will see it, and I will give it to his descendants, the land he will set his feet on, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. That's what God's always looking for, wholehearted trust and faith in him. Excuse me. This is interesting, and again, different. Verse 37. Because of you, the Lord became angry with me also, and said, you shall not enter it either. That's it. That's interesting, because in Numbers, God pretty much, seems to me, gives Moses and Aaron pretty squarely the responsibility. Remember, God told Moses, speak to the rock, and he hit it with his staff. Now he did that because he was frustrated with the people. So I guess that's the connection point. ultimately, right? If you guys hadn't been so whatever, then I wouldn't have got angry and done that. So who's responsible? God holds him responsible. He holds them responsible. Again, maybe one of the things here is they're all part of the same people, and so there's mutual, involvement here in this. So, in any case, but Joshua will enter it. Encourage him. Unlike what you did with me, encourage Joshua, because he will lead Israel to inherit it. These children, they will enter the land. I will give it to them at that time. And then we remember this was in the story too. Pretty similar tracking with Numbers. They said, we've sinned against the Lord. We'll go up and do it. Like, okay, we were wrong. Now we'll do it. And God said, no, now you're not going to do it. Now it's too late. So it didn't work out. They were arrogant. All right, let's keep moving on. I'm long here already today. Okay, this is interesting. I like to wrestle with some stuff here. Okay, so look at this. So they go for it, even though God said no, you're not going for it now. They went for it. They didn't. God wasn't with them, so they weren't successful. Verse 45, you came back and wept before the Lord, but he paid no attention to your weeping and turned a deaf ear to you. So this is really interesting. What are the prayers and intercessions that God responds to? What are perhaps the ones that he's not really responsive to? This is, again, we may not like this, but God doesn't seem particularly sympathetic to the results of their, like, I told you not to do it, you did it, and now you're sad. And it's kind of like, well, what do you want? Right? So in any case, whatever we make of it, let's just kind of check that for a minute and keep going forward with it, because actually something will happen in our text for today with Moses as well. In chapter 2, I just want to kind of make a note to say, because we looked at some of these dynamics in the book of Genesis. In chapter 2, God has a land for Esau's descendants. So remember Jacob and Esau, this kind of, Jacob's the one, Esau's not the one. But remember, we looked at and talked about, even though God has a people that he's uniquely working through in his big picture plan, salvation plan, if you will, it's not that God has no care for others outside of that. It's the focus in on these people, Israel, doesn't mean that other people aren't of any concern. Ultimately, the promise to Abraham is that all the nations will be blessed through him. But in particular, Abraham's other son, Esau, and his descendants, they have a land, and the Israelites that's not for them. You don't set a foot in it. If you take, you pay. It's not yours to take. And so this isn't like God's people here, Israel. It's not like they just have a blank check. You just go wherever you want, and because you're God's people, you can do anything. No. You can't do whatever you want. You can't take any land you want. You specifically do what God tells you to do. You specifically get the land he tells you to get. And that's how it works. So there's also land for Lot, who's Abraham's nephew, remember, in that story as well too. So not to belabor that, but I just wanted to point that out, because I think in the big picture story, I think that's pretty important. So here's this interesting note. I was looking at chapter 2, verse 14 and following. 38 years had passed from the time we left Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the Zered Valley. By then, the entire generation of fighting men who had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. The Lord's hand was against them until he had completely eliminated them from the camp. So here's the idea. God's positive promise, if you will, stands. God's vow also for the consequence stands. Like when God makes that level of commitment, he follows through with it. But here's the complication. we tend to think about either all good, all blessed, or kind of all punish, all curse. But this consequence that God gave the generation that did not trust him to enter the land, that they would not make it. They would wander for 40 years and they would all die out. He didn't kill them on the spot. Now, other people get killed on the spot, but not all of them. And here's the complicating factor. God still provided for them, even though they weren't going to enter the promised land. Isn't that interesting? They still got the manna day by day. They still did the sacrifices in the tabernacle. They still were led, by God's, cloud and fire along the way. So isn't that interesting that even with this consequence, it's not that God's grace is just absent from them. He still provided all those things for them. And yet the consequence was that they weren't going to enter the land. So that's just interesting, I think, to sort of think about. In some ways, the story becomes really simplified. In other ways, it becomes a little bit complicated. Complicated is the word, but there's a lot to it. So it's really just interesting, I think, to kind of track with all these dynamics together as we explore this story that is so cool. All right, chapter 3, defeat of some enemies here along the way. I'm just essence of time. I'm half an hour in. Oh my goodness. We have some of the division of this land is in chapter 3, and let's just look for a second at the end of chapter 3. Moses forbidden to cross the Jordan. This is, again, one of those things that we already knew from Numbers, that we talked about already in this video today, that Moses wasn't going to enter the promised land. And in Numbers, he seemed to just accept it. Here in Deuteronomy, he's wrestling a little bit. Okay. Verse 23, chapter 3, Deuteronomy. At that time, I pleaded with the Lord, Sovereign Lord, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven and earth that can do the mighty works like you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country of Lebanon. So I don't think he's asking to necessarily, maybe he is, if he's asking just to go in and live long in there. But I think he's looking to say, let me at least experience it. Let me at least get over there, set my foot in there, and maybe then I can die. But it ain't going to happen, which we already know from Numbers, right? Verse 26, but because, and again, in Deuteronomy, Moses seems to be so far always blaming the people, and it's the same circumstance, the same story. But that's what because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. So again, that's interesting. When we look at Moses' freedom and intercession with God. Remember the times when God is like, I'm gonna wipe them out, and Moses is like, no, God, how is that gonna look? Remember your promises. And God says, okay. And again, we can think about whether God's just kind of testing Moses, or however that works. We're continuing to think about that. But in any case, in this moment, in this particular situation, rather, it says you would not listen to me. So this is one time so far where Moses makes a request that God says no. You're not going in. It's not going to happen. That's it. That is enough, the Lord said. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. God said, I don't want to hear it. So again, this is interesting. Moses is like, remember God said, there's nobody like Moses. Other people I give visions and dreams. With him I speak face to face. I mean, man, the invitation, the intimacy with God that Moses had, and even so, God says no. Don't ask me again. It's a no. It's going to be a no. But verse 27, there still is a gift or grace in here. He says, go up and look at the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross the Jordan. I think this was a good thing, right? I mean, I guess it could be a frustrating thing. You can see it, but not taste it, so to speak. But I think it's a good thing. He's able to see what he kind of helped bring them to this place, and to see what was ahead of him. So that's the end. Here, Joshua is commissioned to go sort of in there. Moses, we're going to hear a lot more from Moses all through the book of Deuteronomy. End of the book of Deuteronomy is going to be his death. But there's a lesson here. I mean, we're learning, I think, a lot of lessons. One about, it's not just about the individual, but it's about the whole. Both and, not either or. But also it's more than just for us. I think it seems baffling to think that there could be a promise of God that's beyond our generation. So God makes a promise to you and to me, but we don't actually see it, on this earth during this life. It's got either a future generation or an eternal fulfillment. And that's the case with Moses. So we really, I think, the bottom line is, I think we're really self-centered. We want it quick. We want it now. We want it for us. We don't want consequences, all these things. And so these scriptures are teaching us some very important things about God, about ourselves, and about the character that God's trying to build into us, of trust, of perspective, of looking beyond just ourselves, and yet being very responsible for our own actions. So a lot here. I'll see you again tomorrow. Leave your thoughts, questions.